Mail-order bride came expecting a wedding, but found 7 hungry children and no husband waiting at the station. What she did next, no one could have predicted. She became the mother they never had, but always wished for. If Clara's story touched your heart, even just a little, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment about what moved you most, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. And hey, the journey isn't over yet. Stick around for the next chapter. You won't want to miss what happens next. The train's whistle cut through the dry air, sharp as a knife through burlap, and Clara Mayfield stepped onto the platform at Dry Creek Station with 2 battered trunks and a heart heavy with hope she couldn't quite name. She'd read Richard Walker's letter so many times the paper had worn thin at the creases, his words promising a new start, a small ranch, a steady man who worked cattle, a life where she'd never go hungry again. But as the train hissed and groaned behind her, pulling away into the endless Nebraska horizon, there was no broad-shouldered rancher waiting, no weathered hand raised in greeting, no sign scrawled with her name. Just a boy, maybe 14, standing in the dust with boots too big for his feet and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many winters for his years. Clara adjusted her bonnet, squinting against the sun that baked the platform's warped boards. The boy didn't move, just watched her, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a patched jacket. His hair was the color of wheat left too long in the field, and his jaw was set like he was chewing on words he wasn't ready to spit out. She took a step forward, her skirt catching on the edge of a trunk, and cleared her throat. He nodded once, sharp, like he didn't waste gestures. "You Clara Mayfield?" "That's me." She forced a smile, but it felt like trying to light a fire in the rain. "Your pa here." Sam's eyes dropped to the dirt, and for a moment the only sound was the wind rattling through the empty station. "Pa's dead," he said flat as the plane stretching out behind him. "Got killed 2 days back. Cattle rustlers. Jed Harper's men most like over some land fuss." The words hit Clara like a kick to the chest, stealing her breath. She gripped the handle of her trunk, the wood biting into her palm, and blinked hard against the dust, or maybe something else stinging her eyes. "Dead," she repeated, as if saying it again might change the answer. Sam nodded again, his face unreadable. "Buried him yesterday. Me and the others." He looked over her shoulder like he expected her to turn back to the train that was already gone. "Didn't know if you'd still come." Clara's knees felt unsteady, but she locked them in place. She'd crossed half the country, left behind a boarding house in St. Louis, where the walls smelled of mold and the future was thinner than the broth they served. Richard's letter had been her lifeline, his promise of a home and a husband, the only thing keeping her from sinking. Now that promise was dust, just like the ground under her feet. But the boy was still standing there waiting, his eyes searching hers for something she didn't know if she could give. "Well," she said, swallowing the ache in her throat. "I'm here now." "Where's the ranch?" Sam pointed west past a ridge where the grass was more brown than green. "Ain't far, mile or so." He bent to grab one of her trunks, his thin frame straining under the weight but not faltering. Clara picked up the other, her arms burning as she followed him, her boots sinking into the dry earth. The wind carried the sharp scent of sagebrush, and something sour, like the land itself, was grieving. They walked in silence, the only sounds the creak of the trunks and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the horizon. The trail wound through fields baked hard by the sun, dotted with broken fences that leaned like old men too tired to stand straight. Clara's eyes traced the landscape, taking in the vastness of it, the way it stretched out empty and unforgiving. She'd imagined a green valley, maybe a stream running through it based on Richard's letter. But this place looked like it had forgotten how to hope, much less grow anything soft. Sam didn't look back, but she caught him glancing at her from the corner of his eye, sizing her up. His shoulders were squared, his steps deliberate, like he was leading a herd instead of a woman. She wondered what he saw, a city girl in a faded dress too soft for this land, or something else entirely. She didn't ask. His silence felt like a wall, and she wasn't ready to climb it yet. The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill, and Clara's heart sank deeper than she thought possible. The house was a squat, weathered thing, its logs grayed by years of wind and sun, the porch sagging like it was tired of holding itself up. A barn stood off to the side, its roof half caved, and the yard was a mess of cow dung and scattered hay. A broken fence circled the place, more gaps than posts, and a single rope swing hung limp from a gnarled tree. It wasn't a home. It was a husk clinging to the earth like it was too stubborn to fall apart completely. Sam set her trunk down by the porch steps and wiped his hands on his pants. "This is it," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Ain't much, but it's ours." Clara knotted her throat too tight to speak. She climbed the steps, the boards creaking under her weight, and pushed open the door. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a single room that smelled of ash and unwashed cloth. A rough-hewn table sat in the center, surrounded by 6 children, their faces thin and smudged with dirt. They stared at her silent, their eyes wide and wary, like she was a stranger who might steal what little they had left. A fire flickered in the hearth, more smoke than flame, and a girl with braids stood by it, stirring a pot that gave off a faint, watery smell. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "I was supposed to marry your pa." The girl at the hearth turned her spoon still in hand. She was maybe 12, with eyes sharp as a hawk's and a mouth set in a line that said she didn't trust easy. "I'm Ruth," she said. "This here supper. Ain't much, but it's what we got." Clara stepped closer, peering into the pot. A thin broth, cloudy, with a handful of beans and a single potato cut so small it was barely there. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the sight of its 6 children and a baby living on scraps. She set her satchel down and rolled up her sleeves, the motion automatic, like her hands knew what to do, even if her heart was still reeling. "Got any salt?" she asked. Ruth pointed to a tin on a shelf, rusted at the edges. Clara took it along with a small bundle of dried herbs from her bag and set to work. She added a splash of water from her canteen, crushed the herbs between her fingers, and dropped them into the pot. The smell changed not much, but enough to make the room feel a little less hollow. The children watched, their silence heavy, but their eyes followed her every move like they were waiting for her to prove something. She ladled the broth into mismatched bowls, handing them out one by one. "Eat slow," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Let it settle." The youngest, a boy no older than 4, clutched his bowl with both hands, his knuckles white. The baby, swaddled in a crate by the fire, stirred but didn't cry. Ruth sat last, her spoon scraping the bowl's edge, her eyes never leaving Clara. Sam stood by the door, arms crossed, watching like he was guarding something more than the house. Clara didn't sit. She leaned against the wall, her own hunger, a dull ache she ignored. The fire cracked, spitting sparks onto the hearthstone, and she watched the children eat their spoons, moving slow, deliberate, like they were savoring something they didn't expect to have again. She thought of Richard's letter, the promises of a warm bed and fresh eggs, and felt the weight of his absence settle into her bones. She'd come to be a wife, but there was no husband, no ring, no vow. Just this, a house full of children who looked at her like she might be their last chance, and a boy who carried the weight of a man too soon. Ruth set her bowl down empty and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "You staying?" she asked, her voice sharp but not cruel, like she was testing the ground under Clara's feet. Clara met her gaze, saw the challenge in it, and something else hope buried deep. For now, she said the words coming before she could think them through. "Somebody's got to keep that fire going." Ruth nodded just once and went back to the hearth, picking up the spoon like it was her duty. Sam stayed by the door, his eyes softer now but still watchful. The other children ate in silence, their spoons scraping the fire, hissing. Clara's hands trembled as she tucked them into her apron, not from fear, but from the sudden fierce certainty that she'd stepped into something bigger than herself. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint low of cattle in the distance. Clara glanced at the broken fence through the cracked window, the posts leaning like they were tired of fighting the wind. She thought of Jed Harper, the man Sam had named, and the rustlers who'd taken Richard's life over a patch of dirt. This land was hard, unforgiving, and it didn't care about promises or prayers. But as she watched Ruth stir the pot and Sam stand guard, she felt something shift inside her like a seed taking root in rocky soil. She hadn't come to be a mother, but she'd lit a fire in a cold hearth, fed children who didn't know her name, and stayed when she could have walked away. And in that moment, with the smell of herbs and smoke filling the air, Clara Mayfield took her first step into a role she hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse. 3 days after her arrival, as the morning sun cut through the cracked window and painted the floorboards gold, a shadow fell across the yard. Clara was scrubbing a tin plate in a bucket of cold water when she heard the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of boots on dirt. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and stepped onto the porch. A man stood by the gate, tall and lean, his duster coat stained from travel, a hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to carry a storm of their own. He held the reins of a chestnut horse, its flanks slick with sweat, and a satchel hung heavy from his shoulder. Sam was out by the barn, splitting wood with an axe too big for his hands. He froze mid-swing, his eyes narrowing as he took in the stranger. Without a word, he set the axe down and walked toward the house, his steps quick but steady, like a boy who'd learned to move with purpose. Clara's hand rested on the porch rail, her heart thumping a warning she couldn't quite name. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice low as Sam reached her side. "Uncle Warren." Sam said, his tone flat but sure. "Pa's brother. Ain't seen him in years." Clara's brow furrowed. Richard's letter hadn't mentioned a brother, not once. She watched the man approach his gate slow, like he was measuring the ground before trusting it. His face was weathered lines carved deep around his mouth, and his eyes held a flicker of something regret, maybe, or just the weariness of a man who'd ridden too many trails alone. "You, Clara Mayfield?" he asked, stopping a few feet from the porch. His voice was rough like gravel under a wagon wheel, but it carried a quiet respect. "I am," she said, lifting her chin. "And you're Warren Walker." He nodded, tipping his hat slightly. "Heard about Richard. Came as soon as I could." He glanced at Sam, then back at her. "Didn't expect to find you here. Didn't expect to find a grave instead of a groom." Clara replied, her words sharper than she meant. She caught Sam's quick glance, his mouth twitching like he wasn't sure whether to smile or frown. Warren didn't flinch. He unstrapped the satchel and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, its edges worn soft from handling. "This was Richard's," he said, holding it out. "Found it in his things back when we last spoke. Thought you should have it." Clara took the notebook, her fingers brushing the cracked leather. She opened it slowly as if it might crumble under her touch. Inside, the pages were filled with Richard's uneven scrawl dates of cattle sales notes about feed prices, a sketch of a new fence that never got built. But on the last page, in ink darker than the rest, were words that stopped her breath. "If I die before she arrives, let her keep the land and raise the children if she chooses. Treat her kindly. She's got no one else." Her eyes stung, and she pressed her lips together, willing the tears to stay put. Richard had known his days were short, had written her into his story, even as death loomed. She looked up at Warren, searching his face for a lie, but found only a quiet sorrow that matched her own. "Pa never said you two got along." Sam said, his voice hard, like he was testing the man's right to stand there. "We didn't." Warren admitted, his gaze dropping to the dirt. "I was a fool chasing trouble with wagon trains and card games while he built this place. Last time we spoke, he told me to stay gone. But he sent this anyway." He tapped the notebook. "Said you kids deserved a chance and maybe you'd give it to her." Clara closed the notebook, her hands steady now. "I ain't decided what I'm doing yet," she said, though the words felt like a half-truth. "But I'm here for now." Warren nodded like he understood more than she said. "That's enough for today." He turned to his horse, then paused. "You need anything, I'll be in town a few days. Got a room at the boarding house." She didn't answer, just watched him mount up and ride off the dust, trailing behind him like a ghost. Sam stayed by her side, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You believe him?" he asked. "Don't know yet," Clara said. "But that notebook's real, and so's your pa's wish." Inside the kitchen was quiet, the children scattered about their chores. Ruth stood at the table sorting a handful of dried corn kernels, her braids loose and her face set in that stubborn frown Clara was starting to recognize. The girl's hand never strayed far from the small knife tucked in her belt, a blade no bigger than a paring knife, but sharp enough to mean business. Clara set the notebook on the mantel next to a cracked jug and turned to the pantry, taking stock of what little they had. A slab of salt pork, a sack of black beans, a tin of cornmeal gone gritty from age. "Ruth." Clara called, her voice gentle but firm. "Ever made sourdough bread?" Ruth's eyes flicked up wary. "Mama did. I watched sometimes." "Come here then," Clara said, pulling a wooden bowl from the shelf. "We'll make do with what we got." Ruth hesitated, her fingers brushing the knife handle, but she stepped forward, her shoulders stiff. Clara showed her how to mix the cornmeal with a pinch of the starter she'd brought from St. Louis, her hands moving slow so Ruth could follow. The girl watched, silent at first, then started kneading, her small hands clumsy but determined. Clara didn't correct her, just let her work the rhythm of their hands filling the quiet. "You don't gotta stay," Ruth said suddenly, her voice low like she was afraid of the answer. "We ain't your kin." Clara kept her eyes on the dough, her fingers sticky with meal. "Don't gotta be kin to care," she said. "Your pa thought I might be enough. I'm trying to figure out if he was right." Ruth didn't reply, but her hands moved faster, pressing the dough with a force that wasn't just about bread. Clara saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the kind that comes from losing too much, too young, and felt a pang in her chest. She wanted to reach out to touch the girl's shoulder, but she held back. Trust wasn't built with gestures. It was earned with time. By noon, the kitchen smelled of baking bread, a small miracle in a house that had forgotten warmth. The younger children gathered, drawn by the scent, their faces less guarded now. Clara sliced the loaf, its crust rough but golden, and handed out pieces with a sliver of salt pork. The baby nestled in a crate cooed softly, and for a moment the room felt like a home, not just a shell. But the peace didn't last. That afternoon, a buggy rolled into the yard, its wheels creaking louder than the wind. A man in a black suit stepped down, his hat too clean for a place like Dry Creek. He carried a leather case, and his eyes swept over the ranch like he was counting its worth in dollars. Sam was at the fence mending a post, but he dropped his hammer and moved to Clara's side, his jaw tight. "Mrs. Mayfield?" the man asked, his voice smooth as oil. "I'm Amos Reed, attorney for the Union Pacific. Got business concerning this land." "Ain't Mrs. yet?" Clara said, crossing her arms. "What's your business?" Reed pulled a paper from his case, its edges crisp with a red seal. "Richard Walker owed debts to the railroad. This land's collateral. Without payment, it's forfeit, and those children." He glanced at the house where Ruth stood in the doorway, her knife glinting, become wards of the county. Clara's stomach twisted, but she kept her face steady. "I got a will," she said, nodding toward the notebook on the mantel. "Richard left this place to me for the kids." Reed's smile was thin like a blade. "A handwritten note ain't legal without a witness. And folks in town are talking, saying you're squatting using those orphans to claim what ain't yours." Sam stepped forward, his fists clenched. "She ain't using us. She's feeding us." "Easy, boy," Reed said, his eyes cold. "Law don't care about feelings. You got a week to show proof or clear out." He climbed back into the buggy, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavier silence. Clara stood rooted, the notebook's words echoing in her mind. Ruth appeared at her side, her knife still in hand, her voice barely a whisper. "They gonna take us?" "Not if I can help it," Clara said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. She looked at the children, their faces pale but watching, and felt Richard's will settle into her bones. Clara stood rooted, the notebook's words echoing in her mind. Richard's will a heavy anchor in her chest as Amos Reed's buggy vanished into the dust. Ruth lingered at her side, her small knife glinting in the fading light, her voice barely a whisper. "They gonna take us? Not if I can help it," Clara said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. She looked at the children, their faces pale but watching, and felt Richard's will settle into her bones, a promise she hadn't made but couldn't break. The wind howled colder now, carrying the first bite of winter, and Clara knew the fight for this house was just beginning. Winter came to Dry Creek like a creditor, early and unyielding, blanketing the ranch in snow so thick it buried the fence posts and turned the yard into a sea of white. The cold seeped through the cabin's cracked walls, curling around the children's thin blankets and settling into their bones. By the second week, sickness followed swift and merciless. Jonah, the youngest boy after the baby, woke with a cough that rattled his small frame, his cheeks flushed red against skin too pale. Ruth's breathing grew ragged, a wet rasp that left specks of blood on her sleeve when she tried to hide it. The baby, tucked in her crate by the hearth, stopped crying altogether, her silence more terrifying than any wail. Clara didn't sleep. Her days blurred into nights marked by boiling pine needle tea, soaking rags in cold well water and pressing them to fevered foreheads. She moved from one child to the next, her hands raw from stoking the fire, her voice hoarse from humming lullabies she didn't know she remembered. The cabin smelled of damp wool and bitter herbs, the air thick with worry. She whispered promises, "You'll feel better by morning," knowing they were lies, but praying they'd hold true. Her knees ached from kneeling by their pallets, her eyes burned from watching their shallow breaths, but she didn't stop. she couldn't. On the fourth day, as snow piled against the door, Warren rode up his horse, struggling through the drifts. He carried a sack of firewood and a jar of salt, the kind used for curing meat, but good enough for broth. Clara met him at the porch, her shawl pulled tight, her face drawn from sleepless nights. "They're burning up," she said, her voice cracking. "Jonah's worst. Ruth's coughing blood. The baby's barely moving." Warren dropped the wood by the hearth and set to work, his hands steady from years of fixing what was broken on the trail. He rigged a steam tent from an old blanket and a kettle, the hot vapor easing Jonah's breathing. Clara watched, grateful but wary, still unsure of this man who'd walked out of Richard's shadow. They took turns through the night, Clara ladling broth into small mouths, Warren keeping the fire alive. When Ruth collapsed against the wall, too weak to stand, Clara caught her, holding her close until the trembling eased. On the third night, with the wind screaming, Clara sank to her knees by the hearth. She wasn't a praying woman, not after years in boarding houses where hope was scarce. But with 6 children and a baby fighting for breath, she bowed her head and whispered, "Don't take them. Take anything else but not them." The fire flared just once, and she clung to that spark. Dawn broke gray and quiet, the storm easing. Ruth stirred first, her eyes clear, and whispered, "Mama." The word hung fragile but heavy, and Clara froze her hand on Ruth's cheek. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Jonah asked for bread, his voice weak but steady. The baby whimpered, a living sound that broke Clara's heart anew. Sam, who'd held on longest, sat up and said, "You stayed. Always will," Clara said, tears spilling. She lay down among the children, their bodies pressed close, their breaths anchoring her. They weren't strangers anymore. They were hers. But the ranch wasn't safe. That morning, Sam called her to the back fence. Footprints too large for the children circled the cattle shed. The storm outside had passed, but another was coming, and it wouldn't be snow. Chapter 4. Enemies in the Shadows. The footprints were the first warning, half buried in the snow, a quiet threat circling the cattle shed. Over the next week, the signs grew bolder. A chicken gone, its feathers scattered. A fence wire cut clean. A pile of straw tucked against the woods, too neat to be natural. Clara walked the perimeter each morning, her boots crunching frost, her eyes scanning the ridge. Sam stayed close, his rifle never far, his face hard. Warren, lingering after the fever, slept in the barn, his shotgun across his lap, watching the pines. "They're Harper's men," Sam said one evening by the fire. "Jed Harper's been after this land since Pa wouldn't sell. Now he's circling." Clara nodded, mending Jonah's shirt, her hands steady. She'd heard the name too often. Jed Harper, the rustler who'd killed Richard, his greed reaching beyond cattle to this dirt. She didn't know his face, but she felt his shadow. Trouble came at noon when Amos Reed returned, a Pinkerton detective at his side, his badge glinting like a threat. Reed's case was stuffed with papers, his smile sharp. The detective, scarred and flint-eyed, rested a hand on his pistol. "Miss Mayfield Reed said this land sold to the Union Pacific. Your claim's no good. Richard's debts outstrip his will. Those children ain't yours by law. They're headed to the orphanage come morning." Clara stood on the porch, apron, stained hands steady. "I got Richard's notebook," she said, holding it up. "He left this place to me for the kids." Reed laughed, cold and sharp. "A scribble don't hold in court. You're no kin, no wife." Sam stepped forward, rifle loose but eyes sharp. "She's more family than you'll know." Ruth appeared, knife in her belt, face fierce. The detective's hand tightened on his gun, but Clara raised hers. "You'll take no one today," she said, unyielding. "This house is theirs." "You got till sundown tomorrow," Reed said, his smile gone. They left the silence heavy. That night, cattle bellowed in panic. Clara woke, meeting Sam at the door. "It's Harper," he whispered, "in the shed." Warren was outside, shotgun ready. Clara and Sam moved quietly, their boots soft. They'd planned traps, loose boards, a rope snare, oil-soaked straw. Clara dragged feed to mimic a struggling cow, drawing 3 men with kerchiefs and glinting guns. Warren fired a warning shot, freezing them. Sam lit the straw flames, blocking their retreat. Clara stayed low, her breath shallow. "Drop your guns!" Harper Warren shouted. Jed Harper cursed but complied, his men following. Sam tied their wrists, his knots tight from years of fence mending. Clara watched, hands trembling from the weight of their victory. By morning, Harper was locked in the shed, Warren guarding. Reed returned with the preacher and neighbors, drawn by the gunfire. Warren held up Richard's letters exposing Reed's deals with Harper. "You're done, Reed," he said. The preacher stepped forward. "This woman's kept these children alive. That's claim enough." Reed left, face red. The preacher stepped forward, his wiry frame steady against the wind, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "This woman's kept these children alive. That's claim enough." Amos Reed's face reddened, his mouth opening as if to argue, but the weight of the preacher's words, backed by the neighbors' silent nods, silenced him. He climbed into his buggy, the Pinkerton detective trailing behind, and they rolled away, leaving only dust and a victory that felt too fragile to trust. Neighbors lingered, their arms full of offerings, sacks of flour, a basket of dried apples, a bundle of worn books tied with twine. Clara stood with Ruth and Sam Richards' notebook tucked in her apron pocket, her heart steady but heavy. She wasn't a wife, not by any vow, but she was a mother forged by fire and choice, and the ranch was hers to hold now. The days that followed were a slow piecing together, like mending a quilt from scraps too small to seem useful. Clara woke each morning to the sound of the children stirring their footsteps, softer now, less like they were bracing for loss. The snow still clung to the ground, but the air carried a hint of thaw, a promise that winter wouldn't last forever. Clara took to the work of rebuilding her hands, finding purpose in the small acts that made a house more than walls. She swept the porch until the boards gleamed, patched the roof with shingles salvaged from the barn, and scrubbed the kitchen until it smelled of soap instead of ash. The neighbors' gifts kept coming. A widow brought a jug of molasses. A farmer offered a milk cow that bawled in the yard, its udder heavy with promise. Each gift felt like a vote, a quiet nod that Clara belonged. She sat one evening with a pile of empty flour sacks, their faded print soft under her fingers. The children needed clothes, and she wasn't about to let them shiver through spring. With a pair of shears and a needle, she cut and stitched, turning sacks into shirts and skirts, the seams uneven but strong. Sam watched her work, his boots scuffed from hours mending fences. "You don't gotta do that," he said, his voice low like he was testing her. "Somebody's gotta," Clara replied, not looking up. "And I ain't sending you out in rags." She handed him a patched pair of trousers, the knees reinforced with canvas. He took them, his fingers brushing hers, and for the first time, he didn't look away. Ruth was harder to reach, her knife still tucked in her belt, her eyes sharp with a wariness that hadn't faded. Clara found her one morning by the hearth, staring at the fire like it held answers. "Ever kept a journal?" Clara asked, pulling a small notebook from her trunk, its pages blank but sturdy. Ruth shook her head, her braids swinging. "What for? Ain't got nothing to say." "Everybody's got something," Clara said, setting the notebook on the table. "Write what you're thinking, even if it's just about the weather. Helps you hold on to yourself." Ruth didn't touch the notebook that day, but Clara saw her eyeing it later, her fingers tracing the cover like it was a secret she wasn't ready to open. The ranch changed slowly, like a field turning green after a long drought. The milk cow gave enough to fill a bucket each morning, and Clara taught the younger children to churn butter, their small hands clumsy but eager. The books from the neighbors became a nightly ritual, Clara reading aloud by the fire, her voice steady as the children leaned close, their eyes wide with stories of far-off places. But the real change came one frosty morning when a girl appeared at the gate no older than 16, her arms wrapped around a baby whose cough echoed Jonah's from weeks before. Her name was Liza. Her lips cracked from the wind, her eyes hollow with a fear Clara recognized, the kind that comes from running out of places to go. Clara didn't ask questions. She opened the door, pulled Liza into the warmth, and wrapped her in a quilt patched from old dresses. The girl's shoulders shook, but she didn't cry, just clutched her baby tighter. Ruth, without a word, took the child, rocking it gently, her knife forgotten on the table. Sam set a kettle on his movements, quiet but sure, and soon the smell of tea filled the room. "You don't need saving," Clara said, kneeling beside Liza, her voice soft but firm. "You need to remember, you're worth something. You and that baby both." Liza's eyes met hers wide and raw, and she nodded just once. She stayed not as a guest, but as part of the rhythm that was starting to hold the ranch together. She learned to milk the cow, her hands trembling at first, and helped Clara in the kitchen chopping onions with a focus that said she was hungry for more than food. The children took to her, especially Ruth, who showed her how to braid the baby's hair, her fingers gentle in a way Clara hadn't seen before. The ranch wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a home, its walls holding laughter and the clatter of spoons, the kind of noise that drowns out ghosts. Clara kept Richard's notebook on the mantel, its pages a reminder of the man who'd brought her here. But she started her own, a new one, its pages filled with her neat handwriting lists of chores, notes about the children's growth, a recipe for molasses bread. On the last page, she wrote, "Clara Mayfield Walker, head of household by heart, if not by law." The words felt like a claim, not just to the land, but to the life she was building stitch by stitch, meal by meal. March came to Dry Creek slow, the snow melting into patches of mud that clung to boots and hope alike. The ranch woke each morning to the sound of the milk cow lowing, the children's voices rising as they chased each other through the yard. Sam took to the corner of the field where Richard had once dreamed of a chicken coop, his hands digging into the thawing earth to plant tomato seeds. Clara watched him from the porch, her apron dusted with flour, and saw not just a boy, but a young man growing into the weight of his father's absence. Ruth, too, had changed her knife, now tucked away more often than not, her hands busy teaching Liza to mend boots with a needle and waxed thread. The younger children called Clara Mama, without hesitation, the word slipping out like it had always belonged. Clara sat one evening with a pile of scraps, old shirts, a torn skirt, a piece of canvas from a broken wagon cover. She stitched them into a quilt, each patch a piece of their story, the seams holding together a life no one had planned. The children gathered around their fingers, tracing the stitches, their voices soft as they named the fabrics. Pa's shirt, Ruth's old dress, the baby's blanket. The quilt wasn't beautiful, but it was warm, and that was enough. The peace was tested one morning when two county men rode up their coats too clean for the muddy trail, their satchels heavy with papers and red seals. Clara met them at the gate, her hands still damp from washing dishes. Sam stood beside her, his shoulders square, while Ruth lingered at the door, her hand resting on the rifle propped against the frame. "We got a new order," the taller man said, holding up a document. "This land's still in dispute. You ain't got no legal claim to these kids, Miss Mayfield." Clara's heart thudded, but she kept her face steady. "I got Richard's will," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "And I got a house full of children who ain't going nowhere." Ruth stepped forward, her eyes blazing, the rifle now in her hands. "We got a mother," she said, her voice sharp and sure. "Ain't nobody leaving." The men exchanged a glance, but the weight of Ruth's words, backed by Sam's steady gaze, and the neighbors who'd gathered at the fence held them in place. They left without opening their satchels, their horses kicking up mud as they rode off. Clara turned to Ruth, her chest tight with pride and something deeper, and saw a girl who'd grown into her courage. The ranch stood firm, its fences mended its coop, now filled with chickens that scratched and clucked. Clara never remarried, never left the ridge, but she kept Richard's notebook and her own, their pages, a record of a family built not by blood, but by choice. One night she wrote a letter not meant for sending, just folded and tucked into her notebook. "If you find this house," it read, "know that we weren't born lucky. Each of us chose to stay, to love, to build, even with nothing. If you're lost or hungry, come in. There's soup on the fire and a bed in the corner. We've been waiting for you." The words were her truth, written in the quiet of a house that no longer echoed with fear. The children slept soundly, Liza's baby curled beside her, the fire crackling low. Clara stood on the porch, the stars bright above, and felt the weight of a home she'd made not just for herself, but for every soul who'd found their way to her door. And there it is, folks. Clara Mayfield's journey from a hopeful mail-order bride to a fierce, self-made mother of 7 in the heart of the Wild West. I don't know about you, but this story hit me right in the chest. What really moved me wasn't just the plot or the frontier setting, it was Clara herself. A woman with nothing but grit, a letter and 2 suitcases walking straight into the unknown. She didn't just survive, she chose to stay. Through grief, winter sickness, and the threat of being torn from the very children she'd grown to love, Clara never ran. That takes a kind of strength we don't often talk about enough. Quiet, steady, unshakable love. And what's the lesson here? For me, it's that family isn't always about blood. It's about choice. It's about the people we stand up for, the promises we keep, and the homes we build, not inherit. Clara reminds us that being brave doesn't always mean picking up a gun. Sometimes it means picking up a spoon, a sick child, or a broken fence, and doing it every day without thanks. This story is about resilience, compassion, and how love, even when uninvited, can take root in the harshest places. And man, it makes you think right. So now I want to hear from you. What part of Clara's story stayed with you the most? What did you take away from this journey? Drop a comment below. I'll be reading every single one. And hey, if this story touched you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and stay curious.